Stop crying, Emma. It's pathetic. The whisper sliced through the cloying scent of lilies. It was my daughter-in-law, Tiffany, her voice a venomous little hiss over the polished mahogany of my husband Richard's casket. I felt her breath, hot and minty, near my ear. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. The tears on my cheeks felt like they were freezing in place. The real tears, she continued, her perfectly manicured nails tapping once on the wood, a sound like a single final nail being driven home, are for the reading of the will tomorrow. Make sure you wear black for that too. And just like that, she was gone. I watched her reflection in the casket's glossy surface as she turned away. Her face, a mask of contempt a moment ago, crumpled artfully. A delicate sob escaped her lips, perfectly timed for the benefit of a distant cousin who was approaching with a plate of dry-looking finger sandwiches. The performance was flawless. She was a master of her craft. But so was I. I am Emma, 72 years old. In the sterile, air-conditioned funeral home in Maple Creek, Ohio, I am playing the part of the grieving widow. It is the most important role of my life, and I have been in rehearsal for 50 years. My hands, liver-spotted and trembling slightly, are clasped in my lap. My back is straight, a rod of iron beneath the black wool of my dress. My gaze is fixed on a point just beyond the casket, a water stain on the ceiling that looks vaguely like a screaming face. People mistake this stillness for shock, for profound, soul-shattering grief. They are wrong. This is control. My son Leo and his wife are playing the roles of devastated children. Their grief is loud, public, and meticulously documented. I saw Leo a few minutes ago, leaning against a wall, his head bowed. He wasn't praying. The blue light of his phone illuminated his face as he scrolled, his thumb moving with practiced speed. He was probably checking the analytics on the Instagram post Tiffany had uploaded an hour ago. It was a black and white photo of him and Richard on a boat, both smiling, though they hadn't been on a boat together in at least a decade. The caption was a masterwork of curated sorrow. The world feels a little darker today. You taught me everything, Dad. #RIP Dad. Our family is everything. Gone too soon. Tiffany had already reposted it with a string of broken heart emojis. I imagine their social media engagement is through the roof. They are monetizing their grief before the body is even in the ground. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. It wasn't sadness. It was something else, something ancient and patient. My performance is different. It is born of a half-century of silence, 50 years of practiced smiles at Richard's business partners, of nodding pleasantly while their wives discussed their latest trips to Europe, 50 years of learning which questions not to ask. 50 years of living in a beautiful house that never felt like a home, its silence thick with unspoken truths. My grief, if you can call it that, is not for the man in the box. He and I had an arrangement, a transaction sealed not with a kiss, but with the quiet closing of a study door. My grief is for the woman I might have been, the one who died a little bit each day within those silent, perfectly decorated walls. A woman with a kind, wrinkled face I barely recognized touched my arm. "He was a good man, Emma," she murmured. Her name was Doris? Dorothy. I couldn't remember. I had served her canapés at dozens of Richard's Christmas parties. I made myself look at her. I let the corners of my mouth tremble. I produced a single perfect tear that traced the path of the others down my powdered cheek. "Thank you for coming," I whispered, my voice a dry rustle of leaves. She squeezed my arm again, satisfied, and moved on. See? A flawless performance. Leo finally detached himself from the wall and drifted over to me. He placed a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy. An anchor, not a comfort. "You holding up, Mom?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room, already looking for his next conversation, his next opportunity. "I'm all right, dear," I said, keeping my eyes forward. "Just try to get some rest tonight. Tomorrow is going to be a big day," he said, echoing his wife's sentiment, though his was coated in a thin veneer of concern. A big day. For them, it was the finish line. The day they would finally inherit the kingdom Richard had built. They saw the house, the stocks, the offshore accounts. They saw dollar signs. They had no idea what that kingdom was built upon. They didn't know the price of the bricks or the darkness of the mortar that held it all together. But I did. I had lived in the shadow of it for 5 decades. I had breathed its dust. I had kept its secrets locked behind my teeth until they felt like stones in my mouth. Richard had been a meticulous man. He planned everything: his business, his investments, his life. It occurred to me, sitting there on that hard, unforgiving bench, that he must have planned his death, too. And its aftermath. He would not have left anything to chance. He would not have left me to the mercy of the vultures. Tiffany laughed, a high, sharp sound from across the room, quickly muffled into what was supposed to sound like a hiccup of sadness. She was talking to Brody, their lawyer, a man with a smile as slick as the brilliantine in his hair. They were already plotting. I could see it in the way their heads were bent together, their whispers as conspiratorial as Tiffany's had been at the casket. I looked back at the mahogany box. Goodbye, Richard. The performance is almost over. For 50 years I played my part, the quiet wife, the silent partner, the graceful, invisible woman who ran your home and raised your son and never, ever asked about the locked files in your study or the late-night phone calls that ended with a clipped, cold finality. Now, I am playing the part of the grieving widow, and soon I will play my final part, the part you wrote for me. I took a slow, deep breath, the scent of lilies and formaldehyde filling my lungs. For the first time in a very, very long time, it smelled like freedom. My name is Emma. I am 72 years old, and for the past 2 days, I have been a widow. But before I was a widow, or a mother, or even a wife, I was a history teacher. It feels like another lifetime, a story I read about someone else. The memory of it has a scent, the dry, dusty smell of chalk, the sweet perfume of old paper and binding glue from textbooks that had been opened by 1,000 eager hands before mine. It's a smell of purpose, of tangible reality. I can close my eyes and feel the solid weight of a lesson plan in my hands, the satisfying scratch of chalk on a blackboard as I sketched out the rise and fall of empires for a room full of bright, curious faces. In that life, my world was vast, even if my means were modest. It was a world filled with the grand narratives of human struggle and triumph. I taught my students that history wasn't just about dates and names. It was about the choices people made, the silent sacrifices, the currents of ambition and love and betrayal that shaped civilizations. My own life was simple: a small apartment, a salary that was always stretched thin by the end of the month, but a richness of spirit that felt infinite. I was content. I believed I understood the world. Then I met Richard. He wasn't like anyone I had ever known. He didn't just walk into a room, he owned the space he occupied. He had a way of looking at you, a focused intensity that made you feel like you were the only person in the universe. He was brilliant, his mind a razor-sharp instrument that was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else, and he was ambitious. That ambition radiated from him like heat from a furnace. He spoke of the future not as something that happens to you, but as something you build, something you conquer. He promised me the world, and the intoxicating thing was, I believed him. He saw the teacher in me, but he didn't see a life partner. He saw something to be curated, preserved. He wanted to place me on a pedestal, away from the dust and the struggle. He delivered on his promise, in his own way. This house, the one on Sycamore Lane, was the first part of it. When he first brought me here, I was speechless. It wasn't a house, it was a statement. A sprawling testament to success, with pristine white columns and a lawn so perfectly green it looked like a carpet rolled out by God himself. Inside, it was a technological marvel, even back then. Lights that responded to a clap, a sound system with speakers hidden in the walls, a kitchen that felt more like a spaceship's galley. It was a world away from my 2-room apartment with its rattling radiator and drafty windows. This house became my world. The overseas trips followed, the designer clothes, the dinners at restaurants where the water glasses were never empty. He gave me a life of staggering comfort, of effortless luxury, and in return, he asked for only one thing. It was never a demand, never an ultimatum spoken aloud. It was a quiet, unspoken contract, sealed not with ink, but with 1,000 small moments. It was in the way he would gently change the subject if I asked about a late-night phone call. It was in the sudden chill in his voice if I wondered aloud why a business trip had been extended. It was in the locked door of his study, a room I was never, ever to enter. The condition was simple, absolute, and woven into the very fabric of our marriage. I was never to ask questions about his work, my curiosity for our comfort, my silence for our security. It seemed like a fair trade at the time. I was a history teacher. I understood pacts. I understood the compromises people make for the sake of a kingdom. And this was our kingdom. I told myself I was making a sacrifice, the kind a queen makes for her king, for the good of the realm. I would be the keeper of the hearth, the serene, graceful center of the beautiful life he was building. I would raise our son, Leo, in this fortress of privilege, shielded from the harsh realities I once knew. I retired from teaching, packed away my books and my lesson plans, and embraced my new role. I poured myself into being the perfect wife, the perfect mother. I learned to host flawless dinner parties for Richard's associates, men with hard eyes and expensive suits who spoke in coded language I never tried to decipher. I learned to smile and nod, to be a beautiful, silent partner. I learned to fill the long, quiet days in this big, empty house. I gardened, I read, I volunteered. I created a life within the gilded bars of my cage. I convinced myself that the bars were not there, that this was freedom. Raising Leo in this environment was complicated. He grew up seeing the world through the lens of entitlement Richard had crafted. To him, this opulent lifestyle wasn't a prize to be won. It was his birthright. He saw his father as a titan, a man who could bend the world to his will, and he saw me as the quiet, gentle woman who arranged the flowers and made sure his favorite snacks were always in the pantry. A soft place to land. I tried to instill in him the values I once held dear: empathy, humility, and appreciation for the things money couldn't buy. But my voice was a whisper against the roar of Richard's success. How do you teach the value of $1 to a boy who has never once had to check a price tag? How do you explain the beauty of struggle to someone who has never known it? I loved my son with a fierce, protective love. I still do. But I watched, with a quiet ache in my heart, as he grew into a man who mirrored his father's ambition but lacked his substance. He inherited the desire for power, but not the intellect to wield it. And then he brought Tiffany home. From the moment I met her, I felt a deep, instinctual unease. She was a former lifestyle influencer, a woman whose entire identity was built on a curated image of perfection. She looked at our home not as a place of warmth and family, but as a backdrop, a stage. She appraised the furniture, the art, the very air, with the cold, calculating eye of an auctioneer. She didn't see me as her future mother-in-law. She saw me as part of the estate. An old, possibly valuable, but ultimately inconvenient fixture. Richard, for his part, was amused by her. He saw her transparent ambition as a sort of validation of his own success. He tolerated her, perhaps even liked her, in his detached way. And because Leo was besotted, I held my tongue. I smiled. I welcomed her into our family, into our home. Another silent pact, another brick in the wall of the life I had chosen. I told myself this was for Leo's happiness. This, too, was a sacrifice a mother makes. The real shift, the moment the gilded cage became a cold, iron trap, was the day I officially retired from my last volunteer position at the local library. It was the last thread connecting me to the world outside Sycamore Lane, to the woman I used to be. The day I stopped going, my world shrank to the dimensions of this property line. The high, sculpted hedges became the edges of my map. The front door became a checkpoint I rarely passed through. It was then that the golden leash was fastened. Subtly, at first. Richard was still alive, and his presence, however emotionally distant, afforded me a certain status. I was his wife, the matriarch. But the day-to-day running of the household, and by extension my life, had been slowly, methodically ceded to Tiffany. She managed the finances. My access to the fortune I had paid for with my silence was reduced to an allowance. An allowance. The word itself was a profound humiliation. It was a sum Tiffany deemed appropriate for a woman of my age and limited needs, dispensed from a joint account she controlled with Leo. I, who had once managed a classroom of 30 children and a household on a shoestring budget, now had to implicitly ask permission to buy a new pair of gardening gloves. Every credit card statement was scrutinized by her. A small purchase at a bookstore would be met with a bright, false smile and a question laced with condescension. "Oh, another book, Emma. Are you sure you have space on your shelves?" A trip to the local nursery for new rose bushes would prompt a gentle reminder about the budget. She wasn't just managing money, she was managing me. She was asserting control, reminding me of my place. I became a ghost in my own home. My presence was an inconvenience, a relic of a past era that clashed with the sleek, minimalist aesthetic Tiffany was slowly imposing on the house. She treated me like a piece of antique furniture, something to be dusted off, occasionally commented upon, but mostly ignored and worked around. My favorite armchair, a comfortable, worn leather chair where Richard and I had sat for years, was suddenly rehomed to the basement because it disrupted the flow of the room. The paintings I had chosen with care decades ago were replaced with abstract canvases that meant nothing to me. My home was being erased around me, and I was being erased with it. My existence was tolerated only because Richard insisted on it. In his own way, he was loyal. I was part of the deal, part of the life he had built. He would never have allowed them to cast me aside completely while he was drawing breath. His protection was a cold comfort, a shield I didn't even realize was there until it was gone. He was the zookeeper who ensured the prize specimen was fed and sheltered. He didn't offer warmth or companionship, but he maintained the integrity of the enclosure. Now, he is gone. The zookeeper has left the keys on the hook, and I can feel the hungry eyes of the new management on me. For 50 years, I lived by the rule of silence. I never asked about the source of the money that paid for the roof over my head, for the food on my table, for the education that shaped my son. I saw the glimmers of darkness, the sudden trips, the grim-faced men who visited at odd hours, the way Richard would sometimes stare into the distance with a look in his eyes that was a universe away from the charming man I had married. I saw it, and I chose to look away. I chose comfort over conscience. I told myself it was for my family. I told myself it was the price of love. But this house, this beautiful, silent house on Sycamore Lane, it knows the truth. The walls have listened to every hushed phone call, every coded conversation. The foundation is built on secrets I agreed not to unearth. I have been the silent matriarch of a kingdom built on sand, and now the tide is coming in. My son and his wife see me as a final loose end to be tied up. A piece of furniture to be disposed of. They don't know the woman I was. They don't know the history I taught, the stories of empires that crumbled from within, of queens who were underestimated until the very last moment. They see a frail, dependent old woman, a ghost in their machine, and in their greed, they have forgotten the first rule of history. The silent ones are the ones who are listening the closest. I have been listening for 50 years, and my silence is about to end. The sound of the house changed after the funeral. It wasn't the silence that was new. I had lived with a quiet, dignified silence for 50 years. This was a different kind of quiet. A hollow, waiting quiet, like a bell jar had been lowered over the property on Sycamore Street, muffling the world and amplifying every small, cruel noise within. The formal dining room, a space Richard and I had used only for holidays and special occasions, was now their nightly theater. I was not invited. My meals were taken in the kitchen, a solitary affair at the small, formica breakfast nook Richard had installed for me decades ago, so I could watch the birds at the feeder while I drank my morning coffee. Now, it was my designated dining space. I would sit there, the plate of reheated leftovers before me, often a small, congealed portion of whatever grand meal their housekeeper had prepared for them, and listen. The wall between the kitchen and the dining room was thick, but sound has a way of seeping through, especially the sharp, brittle cadence of Tiffany's voice. It carried, not as distinct words at first, but as a tone, a performance. It was a tone of condescending authority, punctuated by Leo's low, indistinct murmurs of agreement. Tonight, it was pot roast. I could smell it. The rich, savory scent of slow-cooked beef and rosemary filled the house, a ghost of a meal I wasn't sharing. On my plate was a slice of yesterday's meatloaf, cold in the center, with a spoonful of instant mashed potatoes. I pushed the food around with my fork, my appetite a distant memory. "It's just a matter of time." Tiffany's voice sliced through the wall, clearer this time. She must have been facing the door. "Honestly, Leo, she's not all there. Did you see her at the service? Staring into space." It was embarrassing. A low rumble from Leo. Not a defense, not a protest, just an acknowledgement. The sound of a man who had outsourced his spine. "And this house," she continued, her voice rising with a familiar, acquisitive excitement. "It's absurd. What is one old woman going to do with 6 bedrooms? It's a complete waste. We need to have a serious conversation about her options once your father's estate is fully settled." I was looking at a place online, The Willows at Pinecrest. It looks adequate. "They have organized activities." I could picture her saying it, swirling a glass of red wine, her eyes scanning the room, mentally redecorating, mentally erasing me. I could see Leo across from her, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone, nodding, scrolling, his attention divided between his wife's monologue and whatever distraction the internet offered. He wasn't a monster. He was worse. He was a vacuum, a space where a son's love should have been. I looked down at my hands, at the liver spots that mapped out my 72 years. Richard had loved these hands. He said they were a teacher's hands, strong, capable, gentle. Now they trembled slightly as I held my fork. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the kitchen window. It was the cold realization that I was no longer a person in my own home. I was a problem to be managed, an asset to be liquidated, an obstacle on their path to the life they felt they deserved. The scraping of a chair from the other room, then footsteps. Leo appeared in the kitchen doorway, still looking at his phone. He didn't make eye contact. "Mom, you doing okay?" he asked the air in front of him. "I'm fine, dear," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy even to my own ears. "Okay, good." He opened the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and left. The entire interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. It was a perfect encapsulation of our relationship. A checklist item. Check on Mom. Done. He returned to the dining room, to the warmth, to the pot roast, to his wife, and the conversation about my impending exile continued, a dull, persistent hum on the other side of the wall. I sat there in the humming silence of the kitchen, the cold meatloaf a lump in my stomach, and felt myself beginning to disappear. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological erosion, executed not with a single brutal blow, but with 1,000 tiny paper-thin cuts. Each one was small enough to seem petty if I complained, but together they bled me of my sense of self, of my place in the world Richard and I had built. It started with the newspaper. For 40 years, the morning delivery of the Maple Creek Gazette was my ritual. I'd fetch it from the porch, the crisp paper cool in my hands, and read it with my coffee, just as Richard had. It was my connection, my quiet half-hour with the world before the day began. One Tuesday, the porch was empty, and the next day, and the day after that. When I finally found the courage to ask, Tiffany, who was directing the gardener to rip out my prized rose bushes to make way for more minimalist ornamental grasses, didn't even turn to look at me. "Oh, I canceled it," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "Such a waste of paper, Emma. And the ink gets everywhere. Besides, everything you need to know is online. It's just clutter." She said it with a bright, false smile that never reached her eyes. The implication was clear. My small joy was an inconvenience. My ritual was clutter. I said nothing. I just went back inside, the space on the kitchen table where the paper should have been looking vast and empty. That was the first cut. The next was my armchair. It was an old, overstuffed wingback in the main living room, upholstered in a faded floral chintz. It was hideous by modern standards, I suppose, but it was my chair. The fabric was worn smooth in the shape of my body. It was where I'd read to a young Leo, where Richard and I had sat in comfortable silence for countless evenings, where I felt most at peace. I came downstairs one afternoon to find it gone. In its place was a monstrosity of chrome and black leather, a sleek, architectural thing that looked like it belonged in a museum lobby. It was cold to the touch and offered no comfort, the angle of its back forcing my spine into an unnatural, painful curve. "What do you think?" Tiffany asked, walking into the room with a glass of iced tea. She ran a hand over the cold leather. "So much better, right? Freshens up the whole room. The old one was just depressing, so dated." "Where is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Oh, the Salvation Army picked it up this morning. I'm sure someone will be thrilled to have it." She took a sip of her tea, her eyes already scanning the room for her next project, her next improvement, her next erasure of me. I stood there, staring at the alien object that had replaced a piece of my life. It wasn't just a chair. It was a repository of memories, of comfort, of identity, and she had given it away like it was trash. I felt a hot, angry pressure behind my eyes, but I swallowed it down. It was the only thing I had left to swallow. The only flicker of warmth in this new, cold life was Chloe, my granddaughter. At 16, she was caught in the impossible space between childhood loyalty and the chilling pragmatism of her parents. She saw what they were doing. She saw the cuts. She couldn't stop them, but she tried to apply tiny bandages in secret. She would sneak into the kitchen when I was there alone, her movements furtive, as if she were a spy in her own home. She'd press a contraband chocolate bar into my hand, or a magazine she'd bought with her own money. "I'm sorry about your chair, Grandma," she whispered one evening, her young face a mask of guilt and sorrow. She sat on the stool opposite me, her knees drawn up to her chest. "Mom said it didn't fit her aesthetic." She said the word aesthetic with a teenager's derision, as if it were a foul taste in her mouth. "It's all right, my dear," I lied, patting her hand. "No, it's not," she insisted, her eyes welling up. "It's not right. They talk about you. Dad just sits there. He doesn't say anything." She looked at me, her gaze desperate. "I'm sorry." "It is not your fault, Chloe," I told her, and I meant it. I pulled her into a hug, her thin frame trembling against mine. In that small, stolen moment, I wasn't an inconvenience or a piece of outdated furniture. I was a grandmother, and in her, I saw a flicker of the boy her father used to be, before the world and his wife had hollowed him out. Her secret kindness was both a comfort and a new kind of pain. It was a reminder of the love that was being systematically dismantled around me, a love that she was now being taught to hide. The final phase of my erasure was digital. It was insidious, silent, and brutally effective. In the world Richard and I had built, everything had been shared: our lives, our home, our finances. In the world Tiffany was building, I was being firewalled out of my own existence. It began with the house itself. Richard, ever fascinated by new technology, had installed a smart home system years ago. We could control the lights, the security, the temperature, all from a central tablet or our phones. It had seemed like a fun novelty. Now, it was a weapon. The house grew colder, and when I went to the wall-mounted tablet to adjust the thermostat, a small box popped up on the screen. "Administrator access required. Please enter password." I didn't have the password. When I asked Tiffany about it, she gave me that tight, patient smile again, the one that made me feel like a child. "Oh, Emma, it's for security. We can't have the settings being changed by accident. It's far too complicated. You'd just get confused. Just tell me if you're cold, and I'll adjust it for you." Of course, when I told her I was cold, she would forget. Or she would turn it up by a single degree for an hour before turning it back down. I started wearing Richard's old wool cardigan around the house, a tangible layer of warmth against the manufactured chill. Next came the memories. Our family photos, decades of them, had been digitized and stored on a shared family cloud account. Birthdays, vacations, Christmases, Chloe's first steps, all of it was there, accessible on the digital photo frame in the living room or on any of our devices. One afternoon, I tried to show Chloe a picture of her as a toddler, chasing seagulls on a beach in Florida. I tapped the screen of my old iPad, the one Richard had set up for me. "Access denied. Your permissions for this account have been changed." I felt a jolt. sharp and physical, as if a door had been slammed in my face. These weren't just files. They were my life, my history, my proof of existence. I was being locked out of my own past. "It's for your own protection, Emma," Tiffany explained later, her tone dripping with false concern. "With all the scams targeting seniors, we have to be so careful with online security. We've consolidated everything under one master account to keep it safe. It's just simpler this way." Simpler. She had stolen my memories and called it simple. I was being systematically, methodically, and quietly dispossessed. I was a ghost in my own home, a tenant in my own life. They took my newspaper, my chair, my warmth, my photos. They spoke about me as if I were already gone, their voices echoing in a house that no longer felt like mine. Each day brought a new, small theft, a new tightening of the net. They thought they were dealing with a frail, confused old woman. They saw my silence as weakness, my compliance as defeat. They didn't understand. They didn't know that 50 years of living with a man like Richard had taught me more than just how to arrange flowers and host dinner parties. It had taught me patience. It had taught me how to watch, how to listen, and how to wait. And as I sat in the growing cold and the encroaching silence, I began to do just that. I waited. I was being poisoned, slowly. But the thing about poison is that it can be administered by more than one person, and I was a very, very patient student. The house was a tomb. The day after the funeral, the forced sympathy had evaporated, leaving behind a silence more oppressive than the hushed platitudes. The flowers, already starting to wilt, filled the air with a sweet, cloying smell of decay that felt far too appropriate. I was in the living room, staring at the empty armchair where Richard had spent his last years, a ghost already fading from the fabric. Leo and Tiffany were gone, attending to some urgent estate preliminary, which I knew was code for meeting with their lawyer to see how quickly they could liquidate my life. I didn't mind the quiet. It was a familiar companion. Then, a sound so alien it made me jolt, the firm, solid knock of a fist on the front door. Not the melodic chime of the doorbell that delivery drivers and neighbors used. This was a deliberate, anachronistic sound. A summons. I moved slowly, my joints protesting, my body feeling every one of its 72 years. I peered through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, his posture ramrod straight. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, the kind you only see in old movies. His hair was silver, neatly combed, and his face was a road map of dignified lines. He was holding a leather briefcase that looked as old and well cared for as he was. He was a relic, and in that moment I felt a strange kinship with him. I opened the door, the chain still in place. "Yes?" His eyes, a pale, intelligent blue, met mine. There was no pity in them, only a calm, professional assessment. "Mrs. Emma Collins?" he asked. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, a stark contrast to Leo's reedy impatience and Tiffany's sharp-edged pronouncements. "I am." "My name is Arthur Davies," he said, holding up a business card to the gap in the door. "I was your husband's personal attorney." He paused, letting the words settle in the heavy air between us. "To be clear, Mrs. Collins, not the family attorney. Your husband's. May I have a word? It concerns certain directives he left with me, to be discussed before the official reading tomorrow." The distinction hung there, a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed. Your husband's. Not the family's, not Leo's, not Tiffany's. My breath caught in my throat. For the first time since Richard's heart had given out, a feeling other than weary resignation began to stir in my chest. It was a dangerous, unfamiliar flicker of something. I fumbled with the chain, my fingers suddenly clumsy, and let him in. He stepped inside, his presence filling the sterile entryway with an old-world gravity. He smelled faintly of paper and wool, a scent of archives and integrity. It was then that I heard the slick slide of expensive shoes on the hardwood floor behind me. "And who might this be?" Tiffany's voice sliced through the moment. She and Leo had returned, their predatory senses likely tingling at the presence of an unknown variable. Standing beside her was a man I recognized with a lurch of my stomach. Brody, their lawyer. He was the opposite of Mr. Davies in every conceivable way, young, with a suit that was more about fashion than function, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Brody stepped forward, positioning himself between me and Mr. Davies like a guard dog. "I'm Brody Cale, counsel for the Collins family estate. All communication regarding the late Mr. Collins's affairs must go through my office." His tone was dismissive, an assertion of absolute control. He looked at Mr. Davies as if he were a piece of lint to be brushed off a lapel. Tiffany crossed her arms, a smug look on her face. "That's right. We have things handled. Whatever you're selling, we're not interested." Mr. Davies didn't even flinch. His calm was a stone wall against which their aggression broke and dissipated. He simply turned his placid blue eyes to Brody. "Mr. Cale," he said, his voice even, "I am not here to discuss the family estate. I am here to fulfill my fiduciary duty to my client, Richard Collins, and to speak directly with his wife, Emma Collins, as per his explicit written instructions." Brody let out a short, derisive laugh. "Look, old-timer, I don't know what game you're playing, but Richard Collins's family is standing right here. Any and all legal matters are my purview. I must insist you leave." Leo, ever his mother's son in a different font, shifted his weight. "Yeah, I think you should go. This is a private time." The hypocrisy was so thick I could have choked on it. Mr. Davies, however, simply opened his briefcase. The clicks of the brass latches were loud in the tense silence. He didn't produce a ream of papers or a threatening legal document. He withdrew a single folded sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. "This," he said, his voice dropping slightly, carrying an undertone of finality, "is a legally binding post-mortem directive and power of attorney, signed and notarized by Richard Collins 6 months prior to his death. It grants me, Arthur Davies, sole and exclusive authority to communicate and execute specific personal directives directly with his spouse, Emma Collins, independent of, and, if necessary, in opposition to any other legal counsel representing his heirs or the broader family estate." He unfolded the document. At the bottom, I could see it clearly from where I stood, Richard's familiar, aggressive signature. A signature I had seen on 1,000 checks, 100 deeds, a lifetime of documents that had built this golden cage around me. Brody's face, for a fleeting second, lost its slick composure. His jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching in his cheek. He snatched the paper from Mr. Davies' hand. His eyes scanned it once, then twice. The silence stretched, taut and humming. Tiffany leaned in, whispering, "What is it? What does it say?" Brody didn't answer her. He just stared at the page, his expression shifting from arrogance to disbelief, and then, finally, to a mask of cold, suppressed fury. He had been outmaneuvered by a dead man. The control he thought was absolute had just been revealed as an illusion. He practically threw the paper back at Mr. Davies. "This is highly irregular." "It is, however, perfectly legal," Mr. Davies replied, calmly folding the document and returning it to his briefcase. He then looked past the 2 younger men, his gaze settling on me. "Mrs. Collins, your sunroom, perhaps?" I find it's always best to discuss delicate matters in the light. Without waiting for a response from Leo or Tiffany, he gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards the back of the house. It was a gesture of alliance. I felt a surge of strength I hadn't accessed in years. I turned my back on my son, my daughter-in-law, and their impotently furious lawyer, and led Mr. Davies toward the sunroom, leaving them standing in the hallway, choking on the dust of their own defeated avarice. The sunroom was my sanctuary, the one place Tiffany's sterile modernism hadn't fully conquered. My old wicker chairs were still there, and the shelves were crowded with my plants. It was a pocket of life in a house that felt increasingly like a mausoleum. Mr. Davies didn't sit down. He stood by the window, looking out at the manicured lawn. The silence wasn't awkward, it was preparatory. He was giving me a moment to breathe, to absorb the small victory in the hallway. "They won't let this go," I said, my voice sounding thin to my own ears. "They have no choice," he replied, turning from the window. "Richard was many things, Mrs. Collins, but a fool was not one of them. He was a master of anticipating moves on a chessboard. He saw this coming." He placed his briefcase on the small glass table and opened it again. But he didn't bring out a will, not the one everyone was waiting for. He brought out a slim black tablet computer and a single ornate, old-fashioned brass key. He slid them across the table toward me. They came to a stop just short of my hands. "Richard left you a path, Emma," he said, using my first name for the first time. The intimacy was startling, professional yet kind. A way to secure your own future, completely independent of them. But it comes with a condition, a significant one. I looked from his face to the tablet, then to the key. My heart was thudding, a slow, heavy drumbeat of fear and anticipation. What condition? His expression grew somber. The professional veneer cracked just enough for me to see the human being beneath, a man burdened by the weight of the secrets he carried. "Richard was a complicated man, Emma," he began, the hesitation in his voice telling me more than the words themselves. "He built this life for you, for your family, the house, the cars, the accounts, all of it." He paused, and his eyes held mine, demanding a connection, demanding I not look away. "To protect yourself, using the tools he left you, you must first do what you have spent 50 years avoiding. You must acknowledge the truth. You must look, unflinchingly, at the source of the money." The air went out of the room. His words landed like stones, shattering the fragile peace, the source of the money, the one unspoken rule of our 50-year marriage. I was a teacher when I met him, full of ideals and a modest salary. He offered me the world on a platinum platter, and all he asked in return was that I never ever ask where the platter came from. I was not to question his late-night calls, his sudden, unexplained trips, the sealed envelopes delivered by silent couriers. I was to be the lady of the manor, the perfect wife, the serene face of his legitimate success. And I had played my part beautifully. I had cultivated a willful blindness, a comfortable ignorance that I had polished daily like the silver. I had told myself he was in private equity or risk assessment, vague terms that meant nothing and everything. I chose not to see the darkness that I knew, deep down, had to be clinging to the foundations of our perfect life. My own denial. It rose up like a wall in front of me, higher and more formidable than any lawyer Tiffany could hire. For 50 years, I had made a pact with myself. I would not know. To know was to be complicit. To know was to shatter the image of the woman I wanted to be. I don't know what you mean," I stammered, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. It was an old, reflexive defense. Mr. Davies's expression didn't change. There was no judgment, only a sad, patient understanding. "With respect, Emma, you do. You've always known there was another side to him. You simply chose not to open the door and look at it. Richard knew this. He knew your denial was both your cage and your shield. But now it is an obstacle, perhaps the greatest one you face. The path to your freedom begins on the other side of that denial. This tablet and that key will show you everything, but you must be the one to turn the key. You must be the one to choose to see." He gestured to the objects on the table. He foresaw their greed, and he built you an ark. But the price of admission is the truth. Are you ready to pay it, Emma? Are you ready to stop ignoring what you've known all along? I stared at the tablet. It was cold, black, and impenetrable. A slab of dark glass holding a truth I had spent a lifetime running from. Could I do it? Could I deliberately tear down the very foundation of my own identity, the good wife who knew nothing of her husband's sins? The alternative was to be devoured by Leo and Tiffany, to be relegated to a state-funded room that smelled of bleach and despair. My freedom was on the other side of a truth that I feared would utterly destroy me. My hand trembled as I reached out, my fingers hovering over the cold brass of the key. That night, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was filled with the hum of unspoken things, with the weight of the tablet sitting on my nightstand. I hadn't touched it. I couldn't. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the years of my carefully constructed ignorance pressing down on me. To look would be to admit my complicity. To not look would be to surrender. A soft knock came at my bedroom door. It wasn't the firm rap of Mr. Davies, but a hesitant, gentle tapping. "Grandma?" Chloe's voice was a whisper in the dark. Come in, dear. The door opened a crack, and my granddaughter slipped inside. At 16, she was caught in that painful space between childhood and the harsh realities of the adult world she was about to inherit. Her face was pale in the moonlight streaming through the window, her eyes red-rimmed and wide with fear. She clutched a worn teddy bear, a relic from a more innocent time. She came and sat on the edge of my bed, her small frame seeming so fragile. I couldn't sleep, she murmured, picking at a loose thread on my quilt. What's wrong, Chloe? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. Tears began to well in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. I heard them, she whispered, her voice cracking. Mom and Dad. They were in the kitchen. They thought I was asleep. She took a shuddering breath. They were on the phone with Mr. Brody. He was laughing, Grandma. He was talking about how the market is perfect for selling the house right now. He said they could get it all finalized in a month. My blood ran cold. And Mom... Chloe's voice dropped even lower, as if she were afraid to say the words out loud. She was looking at websites on her phone for homes. She called them facilities. She was telling Dad that they didn't need anything fancy, just clean and secure. She was looking at the prices. She found one an hour away. She said it was the most cost-effective. She said you wouldn't know the difference anyway. Each word was a physical blow. The cheapest home they could find. A place to store me, to forget me. A place where I wouldn't know the difference. The casual cruelty of it, from my own son, was a breathtaking betrayal. Chloe's face crumpled, and she finally let out the sob she'd been holding back. She threw her arms around my neck, her small body shaking. Please, Grandma, she begged, her voice muffled against my shoulder. Please don't let them do it. I know you're sad about Grandpa. I know you're tired. But you can't let them win. You have to fight them. Please, fight them. Her plea was a knife twisting in my heart. I held her tight, stroking her hair, my own carefully managed composure shattering into a million pieces. She was asking me to fight, but she had no idea what that fight entailed. She didn't know about Mr. Davies, or the tablet, or the 50-year-old truth locked inside it. To fight them meant using the weapons Richard had left me. It meant opening that Pandora's box. It meant learning the specifics of the sins that had paid for this house, for Chloe's private school, for the very clothes on her back. Fighting them meant unleashing a monster, and I was terrified that in the process of saving myself, the fallout would consume the last innocent person in this family. It would destroy her image of her grandfather, her father, of the very life she had always known. I looked over her shaking shoulder at the dark tablet on my nightstand. My choice was no longer simple. It was no longer just about my dignity or my freedom. It was about her. Could I trade her innocence for my survival? Her desperate, tearful plea echoed in the silent room. Fight them. And in that moment, I was faced with the most terrible obstacle of all, the love for my granddaughter, pitted directly against the horrifying price of my own liberation. The silence in the house, after Arthur Davies left, was different. It wasn't the hollow, oppressive silence of my long widowhood, nor the tense, waiting silence of the days leading up to the funeral. This was a charged silence, the kind of quiet that precedes a lightning strike. The air itself felt thin, humming with unspoken words and the ghost of Richard's intricate, posthumous machinations. I sat in my armchair, the one Tiffany hadn't yet managed to replace, and felt the weight of 50 years settle not as a burden, but as armor. Every quiet slight, every ignored opinion, every moment of being treated as a decorative object had been a forging. I hadn't realized it then, but Richard, in his own cold, calculating way, had been preparing me. He hadn't been building a wife. He'd been sharpening a weapon. Mr. Davies' words echoed in the vast, empty space of my mind, clearer than the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He foresaw this, Emma, every bit of it, their greed, their impatience, their contempt for you. He didn't see it as a flaw. He saw it as a tool. A predictable, reliable tool. And then, the most chilling part, the part that made my blood run cold even in the warmth of the living room. The plan only works if they believe you are exactly who they think you are, a fragile, fading woman, lost in grief and confusion. Your performance is not just a suggestion, Emma. It is the linchpin. The entire structure rests upon it. So I would perform. I had been in rehearsal for half a century. This was merely the opening night. The next morning, the smell of burnt toast and Tiffany's cloying, expensive perfume filled the kitchen. It was a combination that always made my stomach clench. Leo was scrolling through his phone, a smirk plastered on his face as he read something. Probably a fawning comment on the social media performance of his father's funeral. Tiffany was bustling around the marble island, making a smoothie in a blender that sounded like a jet engine. The noise was designed to fill the space, to announce her presence, her control. I entered the room with a practiced slowness, my hand trembling just slightly as I gripped the back of a chair for balance. It was a tremor I had perfected. Not the violent shaking of a neurological disorder, but the subtle, intermittent flutter of age and frailty. "Good morning," I said, my voice a little thin, a little reedy. Leo grunted without looking up. Tiffany glanced over, her eyes flicking over me in a quick, dismissive appraisal. "Oh, you're up. I poured you some juice." She gestured with her chin toward a glass on the table. The glass was too large. The orange juice filled almost to the brim. A child's portion. An invitation for a spill. I understood. This was part of the play. I moved toward the table, my steps careful. I sat down, my bones creaking audibly. I made them creak. "Thank you, dear," I murmured, reaching for the glass. My fingers, frail and uncertain, wrapped around the cold, slick surface. I paused for a beat, letting them see the effort. I could feel Tiffany's impatient gaze on me, feel Leo's peripheral awareness, waiting for the inevitable irritation to begin his day. I lifted the glass, and then, with a delicate, almost imperceptible turn of my wrist, I let it tip. The bright orange liquid cascaded across the polished oak of the dining table, a shocking slash of color against the dark wood. It pooled for a moment before dripping in thick, syrupy lines onto the pristine white rug below. Silence. The blender had stopped. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of the juice. I gasped, a small, fluttery sound of distress. "Oh my, oh, I am so sorry. My hands, they just don't listen to me anymore." I looked down at my own hands as if they were traitors. Tiffany let out a long, theatrical sigh, the sound of a martyr pushed to the very edge of her saintly patience. "Honestly, Mother," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She didn't call me Emma anymore. It was always Mother, a title that was meant to sound respectful, but felt like a brand. It's like having a toddler in the house, a clumsy giant toddler. Leo finally looked up from his phone and snickered. A low, ugly sound. "Easy, Tiff. Maybe we should get her a sippy cup for the big day tomorrow." He winked at his wife, a shared moment of cruel amusement at my expense. I didn't respond. I just looked down at the mess. My shoulders slumped in a perfect imitation of shame and helplessness. I let my lower lip tremble. Inside, my heart was a block of ice. My mind was a steel trap. I was replaying Mr. Davies' instructions, his voice calm and steady in my memory. "They will test you. They will poke and prod at your dignity, looking for a reaction. Do not give them one. Your weakness is your shield. Let them believe they are in complete control. Let their arrogance be the fog that blinds them." Tiffany grabbed a handful of paper towels and threw them onto the puddle on the table with disgust. "This rug is ruined. Absolutely ruined. It's an antique." She shot a glare at me. "Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost?" I looked up, my eyes wide and watery. I can try to pay for it," I offered, my voice barely a whisper. The offer was a masterstroke of my own design. I knew I had no money, and they knew I had no money. It was the pathetic, desperate offer of a child who had broken a precious vase. Leo laughed outright this time. "Pay for it? With what? Your pension that Tiffany manages?" He shook his head, still smiling. "Don't worry about it, Mom. After tomorrow we can buy 10 of these rugs, 100. His words hung in the air, thick with greed. After tomorrow. The reading of the will. The day they believed they would inherit the world. They were already spending the money, already redecorating my home in their minds, already consigning me to a beige room in a state-run facility. I just kept my head down, a portrait of defeated old age. I played my part, letting their casual cruelty wash over me. It didn't sting anymore. It was just noise. The chatter of prey walking confidently into a snare. One last time, I was the dotty old woman, the burden, the ghost at their feast. And as Tiffany scrubbed furiously at the floor, complaining about my incompetence, I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. This performance was for them, but the rehearsal was for me. It was a final confirmation that I could do this. I could erase myself, become invisible, a non-entity. And from that place of utter non-existence, I could pull the lever that would bring their entire world crashing down. The juice stain on the antique rug was the first drop of blood in the water. The silence returned after they left. It was the middle of the afternoon, the sun slanting through the bay windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Their departure for what Tiffany had called a triumphant pre-inheritance shopping spree was loud and ostentatious. Leo had backed his luxury sedan out of the driveway with a roar, the tires crunching on the gravel with aggressive satisfaction. Tiffany had called out from the passenger seat, "We'll be back before dinner, Mother. Try not to burn the house down or flood the place while we're gone." Her laughter, sharp and brittle, had echoed for a moment before the car sped away. And then, nothing. The house settled around me, vast and quiet. For years, this silence had been my tormentor, a constant reminder of my isolation. Today, it was my accomplice. It was my sanctuary. It was the sterile, soundproof room in which a delicate and dangerous operation could be performed. I waited. I didn't move from my chair for a full 10 minutes, simply breathing in the quiet. I listened for the phantom sound of their car returning, for a forgotten phone or wallet to bring them back unexpectedly. It was a paranoia born of long conditioning, but it was also a necessary precaution. The linchpin, Mr. Davies had called me. A linchpin cannot afford to be careless. Finally, satisfied that I was truly alone, I rose. My movements were no longer frail or hesitant. I walked with a steady, determined gait, my back straight, my purpose clear. I went not to the kitchen or the living room, but to Richard's study. The room was just as he had left it. It was the one space Tiffany hadn't dared to touch yet, intimidated perhaps by the sheer weight of his presence that still lingered among the leather-bound books and dark, heavy furniture. The air smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and secrets. For 50 years, this room had been his domain, a place I rarely entered and never felt welcome. I had been the wife, the hostess, the manager of the public-facing aspects of our lives. This room was the engine room, the place where the real work was done, and I had been kept firmly on the passenger deck. I ran my hand over the cool, polished surface of his mahogany desk. There was no sentimentality in the gesture. It was an assessment, a claiming of territory. My eyes scanned the bookshelves not at the titles, but at the spines, the dust, the order of things. Everything was a piece of the puzzle he had left me. Mr. Davies had been precise. In his desk, top left drawer, beneath a false bottom, you will find a small sealed envelope. It has been there for 30 years. Inside is a piece of paper, with a telephone number and nothing else. Richard was a man of immense foresight, and I must admit, a certain theatrical flair. I pulled the heavy chair out and sat down. It felt strange, sitting in his seat of power. I opened the top left drawer. It was filled with mundane things, stationery, old pens, paper clips. I ran my fingers along the bottom, feeling for the seam Mr. Davies had described. There it was, a faint line in the wood. Using my fingernail, I pried it up. The false bottom lifted easily, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. And there it was, a small, yellowed envelope, sealed with a wax stamp of the family crest, a crest Richard had designed himself. My name, Emma, was written on the front in his sharp, slanted handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. This was a message from the grave, a piece of a plan set in motion before Chloe was even born, before Leo had become the man he was, before the gray had even started to streak my hair. My fingers trembled for real this time as I broke the seal. The wax crumbled, dry and ancient. Inside was not a letter, but a small, stiff piece of cardstock. On it, written in the same ink, was a string of numbers, an international telephone number. Nothing else. No name, no country code, no instructions. I stared at the number, the digits seeming to swim before my eyes. This was the point of no return. The breakfast spill was a performance. This was an action. This was the first true step off the cliff. I took the card and walked to the old rotary phone on the corner of the desk. Richard had always refused to get rid of it, calling it a reliable tool in an unreliable world. I saw now that it wasn't nostalgia. A rotary phone is not easily tapped. It leaves no digital footprint. Another piece of his meticulous paranoia. I picked up the heavy Bakelite receiver, the familiar weight of it solid in my palm. I listened to the dial tone, a low, steady hum. The sound of my own pulse was a frantic drum against it. My mind raced. What was I about to unleash? Who was on the other end of this line? Mr. Davies had told me not to ask questions, only to follow the instructions. Richard has already accounted for all the variables, Emma. Your only variable is your own nerve. I thought of Chloe's tear-streaked face, her small voice pleading, "Fight them, Grandma, please." I thought of Tiffany's sneer, Leo's snickering laugh, 50 years of being a beautiful, silent fixture in a gilded cage. My nerves solidified. I placed my finger in the hole for the first digit and pulled the rotary dial around. The whirring sound as it spun back was deafening in the silence. One number after another, a slow, deliberate process, a mechanical prayer. With each number, I felt like I was turning a key in a massive, unseen lock. After the last digit, the line clicked. There was a pause, a rush of static, and then a strange double ringtone. A European ring. My heart hammered against my ribs. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, a man answered. His voice was flat, without inflection, and had a faint, unplaceable accent. Yes. Not hello. Just yes. My own voice felt trapped in my throat. I swallowed, forcing it out. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the part Richard had made me memorize over 30 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He had said it to me casually, as if he were remarking on the weather. "Emma, remember this for me, would you? It's for a poem I'm working on." And he had made me repeat it, 3 times, until the words were smooth and meaningless in my memory, a phrase I never understood. Until now. "The winter sparrows," I said, my voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me, "have found their southern home." There was a moment of absolute silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint crackle of the international connection, a sound like fire consuming dry leaves. I held my breath. Then the voice came back, just as flat and unemotional as before. "The message is received. The accounts will be prepared for transfer. The nest is being cleared. It is done." A single, decisive click. The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, holding the receiver to my ear, listening to the empty hum of the dial tone. It was done. I had no idea what accounts or the nest meant, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had just armed a bomb and placed it directly into the greedy, outstretched hands of my son and his wife. I carefully placed the receiver back in its cradle. The click was the sound of a cell door locking. I walked back to the desk, put the yellowed envelope and the small card with the number into the ashtray, and lit a match. I watched them curl and blacken, turning into gray, feathery ash. No evidence, no trace. I left the study, closing the door softly behind me. The house was still silent, but it was a new silence now. It was the quiet of a web, freshly spun, glistening with dew, waiting patiently for the blundering flies to arrive. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the dawn. The air in Brody's conference room was the color of old money and tasted of recycled fear. It was a space designed to intimidate, with its dark mahogany table polished to a mirror shine, its leather chairs that sighed when you sat, and a panoramic window showcasing a city that felt 1,000,000 miles away. It was a room for winners, and Tiffany sat at the head of the table as if the chair were a throne she had been born to inherit. She was practically vibrating, a high-frequency hum of pure, unadulterated greed. Her fingers, tipped with blood-red nails, tapped an impatient rhythm against a leather-bound folio. Next to her, Leo was a pale imitation of a man, his shoulders slumped, his gaze flitting nervously between his wife and the two lawyers. He looked like a man already carrying a weight he couldn't comprehend. Across from them sat Arthur Davies. He was a relic from a different era, a man who seemed carved from granite and integrity. His suit was dated but immaculate, his hands folded calmly on the table. He was Richard's man, not ours, and his presence was a quiet rebuke to the entire garish performance. Brody, our family lawyer, sat beside him, looking flustered and out of his depth, a cheap suit in a room of bespoke power plays. And then there was me. I sat at the far end of the table, small and quiet, playing the part I had perfected over the past few weeks. The grieving widow, lost in a fog of sorrow and confusion. My hands trembled slightly in my lap, a deliberate, practiced tremor. I let my gaze remain unfocused, drifting towards the window, as if the proceedings were too much for my frail mind. But I saw everything. I saw the predatory gleam in Tiffany's eyes. I saw the sweat on Leo's upper lip. I saw the rigid control in Mr. Davies's posture. "If we are all present," Brody began, his voice a little too loud, a little too eager to please, "we can commence with the reading of Richard Collins' last will and testament." Tiffany leaned forward, her smile sharp. "Finally, let's get this over with." Mr. Davies cleared his throat, a dry, precise sound that cut through Tiffany's impatience. He didn't look at her. His eyes, cool and gray, met mine for a fraction of a second before he opened a simple, unassuming manila folder. "Before we begin," he said, his voice calm and measured, "it is my duty to inform you that Mr. Collins's final wishes were specific. He was a man of meticulous detail, as you know. The will is structured to ensure his legacy is passed on in a manner of his exact choosing. His legacy is his money," Tiffany snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "It goes to Leo, his son. It's simple. We don't need the theatrics, Mr. Davies." Brody shifted uncomfortably. "Tiffany, please, let Mr. Davies proceed according to protocol." Mr. Davies ignored them both, his focus entirely on the document in front of him. "The will is, as you suspect, straightforward in its primary directive," he began, his tone becoming formal, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "It states that the entirety of Richard Collins's estate, and I must stress the word entirety, including all business assets, domestic and international holdings, intellectual properties, and their associated liabilities, pass to a single heir." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Liabilities. The word was a hook, baited and cast, but Tiffany was a fish too hungry to notice the line. Her eyes were glazed over with visions of stock portfolios and offshore accounts. "A single heir," she repeated, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She glanced at Leo, who offered a weak, uncertain smile. "Well, that's that then." "Leo is the son, the direct bloodline. It's obviously him." She turned her sharp gaze back to Davies. "So how much are we talking about? Let's get to the numbers." Mr. Davies looked up from the paper, his expression unreadable. "No," he said. The word was not loud, but it silenced the room. It was absolute. Tiffany's triumphant smile faltered. "No? What do you mean, no? It has to be Leo." "The will does not name an individual," Mr. Davies explained calmly, his gaze sweeping over Tiffany and Leo before landing once again on me. I kept my expression vacant, my breath steady. Richard was concerned about the burden of his estate. He did not wish to force it upon an unwilling party. Therefore, the will designates that the estate, in its totality, passes to the individual who formally and officially accepts it in writing. It is a fail-safe, The sole inheritor is the one who claims the inheritance. A silence descended. It was a different kind of silence now, one tinged with confusion. Brody frowned, flipping through his own copy of the documents, his brow furrowed. He clearly hadn't anticipated this. Leo looked at his wife, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. He opened his mouth, perhaps to ask a question, to suggest caution, to do what he should have done his entire life and think for himself. But he was too slow. Tiffany's mind, a calculator of greed, had already finished the equation. Unwilling party. Burden. To her, these words were absurd. This was the jackpot, the finish line. The idea that anyone would hesitate was inconceivable. She saw it as a test, and she was the only one smart enough to pass. Before Leo could utter a single syllable, she shot to her feet. The sudden movement made her chair scrape harshly against the floor. Her eyes were blazing. "I accept," she declared, her voice ringing with triumphant finality. "This is ridiculous. It's a formality. On behalf of our family, I accept the inheritance." Mr. Davies didn't flinch. "To be clear, Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice dangerously even. "The document specifies a single signatory. The individual who signs becomes the sole legal inheritor of everything, the assets and the liabilities. It is not a collective acceptance." "I understand," she spat, her patience gone. She saw this as a final, pathetic attempt by a dusty old lawyer to cling to relevance. She looked at Leo, who seemed frozen, and then at me, with a look of pure contempt. She thought I was too senile to understand, and Leo was too weak to act. In her mind, she was saving the family fortune from our incompetence. I'm his son's wife. It's the same thing. Give me the pen. Brody started to speak. "Tiffany, perhaps we should take a moment to review the codicil regarding—" "Give it to me," she commanded, holding her hand out. With an almost imperceptible slowness, Mr. Davies slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. It was an acceptance addendum, simple and stark. At the bottom was a single line for a signature. He placed a heavy black fountain pen beside it. Tiffany snatched the pen. She didn't read the document. Her eyes were fixed on the prize. With a flourish of theatrical impatience, she scrawled her name across the bottom line. The scratch of the nib on the thick paper was the only sound. Tiffany Collins. The signature was large and aggressive, a flag planted on conquered territory. She slammed the pen down on the table, a punctuation mark on her victory, and leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing on her lips. She had won. She looked directly at me, her eyes saying, "It's mine now. You are nothing." I held her gaze for a moment, letting a flicker of what she might mistake for confused hurt cross my face. Inside, a cold, quiet satisfaction began to bloom, a flower of ice growing in my chest. The trap was sprung. The key had turned in the lock. Mr. Davies picked up the signed document. He inspected the signature for a moment, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He then slid it neatly into his folder. "Very well," he said, the words now carrying an entirely new weight. "The inheritance is legally transferred. Congratulations, Mrs. Collins. You are the sole successor to Richard's entire enterprise." He folded his hands again. The room waited. Tiffany tapped her foot, expecting him to now produce bank statements, deeds, and keys to safety deposit boxes. "So?" she prompted. "The portfolio? Account access?" "Of course," Mr. Davies said smoothly. "As the new legal custodian of the operation, the first order of business is for you to view the asset orientation package. Richard prepared it himself. He felt a hands-on overview was more effective." He didn't reach for a folder. Instead, he picked up a small remote and pointed it at a large dark screen mounted on the far wall, a screen I had assumed was for corporate presentations. He pressed a button. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a bank statement from the Cayman Islands. It was Richard's face. But it wasn't the Richard I had known, or the one they remembered. There was no warmth, no feigned paternal smile. His face, captured in high-definition video, was cold, dead-eyed, and utterly devoid of emotion. He was seated in an office I had never seen, stark and modern, more like a bunker than a workspace. He stared directly into the camera, as if he could see through the screen, through time itself, and into this very room. An unnerving silence fell as his recorded image stared out at us. Tiffany's smirk vanished, replaced by a frown of confusion. What is this? Some kind of memorial video? And then Richard spoke. His voice, stripped of all life, filled the conference room. It was flat, clinical, and chilling. "If you are watching this," he said, "then I am dead. And you." His dead eyes seemed to bore directly into Tiffany. "Are my successor." The word hung in the air, twisted and malevolent. Successor, not heir. The screen behind Richard's head changed, displaying not family photos, but a complex, branching diagram of encrypted server networks. "For 50 years, Richard's voiceover continued, "my family enjoyed a lifestyle of immense privilege. They believed it was built on clever investments and market savvy. They were wrong. They were intentionally kept ignorant, because the truth is a burden, a liability." My gaze shifted to Tiffany. Her face, a moment ago so flush with victory, was beginning to pale. She was still processing, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. The video cut to a screen recording. A cursor moved silently across a dark web interface, a place of shadows and code. It opened a file. On the screen was the name of a prominent federal judge. Beside it, a folder labeled Henderson.avi. The cursor clicked. For a split second, a video played. No sound, just a grainy image of the judge in a compromising illegal act before the file was closed. My primary business, my true asset, was never stocks or real estate. Richard's voice explained. It was information, leverage. I built the most sophisticated and private blackmailing empire on the planet. I held the secrets of men and women you read about every day, politicians, CEOs, foreign dignitaries. They paid for my silence. That was our income. Leo made a small, strangled sound. He looked like he was going to be sick. The screen shifted again. It showed a dizzying flow chart of offshore accounts, a spiderweb of transactions moving through shell corporations in Panama, Cyprus, and Macau. "This is not a portfolio for holding wealth," Richard stated. "This is a laundering system, a necessary mechanism for cleaning payments from clients who cannot be seen paying an extortionist. It is complex, it is volatile, and it requires constant management." Tiffany was no longer sitting upright. She had shrunk in her chair, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving a mask of waxy, horrified disbelief. The video cut back to Richard's dead-eyed stare. "The liabilities mentioned in my will are not financial debts," he said. And for the first time, a sliver of something dark and cruel entered his tone, a ghostly echo of a smile. "The liabilities are the active extortion plots, the ongoing operations, the clients. These are not businessmen who will accept a letter from a lawyer explaining a delay in service. They are dangerous people who will not tolerate failure, incompetence, or exposure. By signing your name, you have not inherited my money. You have inherited my contracts, my enemies, my sins." The screen displayed a final message in stark white text against a black background. "The entire operation is now legally yours. Good luck." Then the screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where sound and hope had ceased to exist. It lasted for 3, maybe 4 seconds. And then Leo, his face a ghastly shade of green, lunged forward and vomited violently into the chrome wastebasket beside his chair. The sound was retching, guttural, and obscene. It broke the spell. The room exploded into pure, unadulterated chaos. "No," Tiffany whispered, the word a dry rasp. "No, no. This is a joke, a sick joke." She looked at Mr. Davies, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost animalistic. "This isn't legal." "You can't do this!" Brody, our lawyer, was on his feet, his face ashen. He was stammering, pointing a trembling finger at Davies. "What have you done? This is a criminal conspiracy. We've been made party to a criminal." He trailed off, the full implication of what had just happened crashing down on him. He wasn't just a lawyer in a will reading anymore. He was a witness, an accessory. "The document Mrs. Collins signed is legally binding," Mr. Davies said, his voice the only calm anchor in the storm. He stood up, gathering his simple folder. "She has willingly and with full disclosure of the terms, assets, and liabilities, accepted the inheritance. The transfer of ownership is complete. My obligations here are fulfilled." "Undo it!" Tiffany shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob. She clawed at the table, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "I take it back." "I don't want it." Leo was still heaving into the bin, gasping for air between agonizing spasms. I remained seated, a statue of feigned bewilderment. I watched the woman who had tormented me, who had tried to erase me, completely and utterly disintegrate. She had wanted Richard's power. She had craved the throne. Now she was shackled to it, and the crown was made of poison. Her greed hadn't just been her undoing, it had been her damnation. And as I watched the beautiful, glorious chaos she had signed for, I felt the last 50 years of silent servitude fall away from me like a shroud. I was finally, breathtakingly free. The sound of a soul breaking is not a scream. It is a sharp, sudden intake of air, a gasp that sucks all the oxygen from a room. That was the sound Tiffany made. Her face, which moments before had been a mask of triumphant greed, was now a canvas of pure, uncomprehending horror. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, on the smiling, posthumous image of Richard, as his calm voice detailed the true nature of her inheritance, the life sentence she had just so eagerly signed for. Leo was making a different sound. A low, guttural moan that clawed its way up from his gut. He was shaking his head, a frantic, repetitive motion, as if he could physically dislodge the reality crashing down upon him. No, he wouldn't. He couldn't. Brody, their slick family lawyer, was a statue of uselessness. His mouth hung open, his face pale. He looked from Tiffany's signature, a bold, arrogant scrawl on the page, to the video, to his client's disintegrating composure. The predator had become the prey, and he had no script for this. Amidst the rising tide of hysteria, I stood up. The fabric of my simple dress made no sound. My chair didn't scrape against the polished floor. It was as if I had become a ghost in the room, my purpose served. I didn't look at Tiffany, who was now beginning to sob, a raw, ugly sound of terror, not grief. I didn't look at Leo, who had buried his face in his hands. I didn't look at Arthur Davies, who gave me a brief, almost imperceptible nod of confirmation. My gaze was fixed on the door. My feet moved, one in front of the other, carrying me across the thick, expensive carpet. I walked past the pandemonium, the epicenter of a world imploding. Brody was fumbling with his phone, his voice cracking as he said something about security and misrepresentation. Accusations began to fly, sharp and desperate, like shrapnel from a grenade. They weren't directed at me. They didn't see me anymore. They were trapped in a vortex with the ghost of Richard, a ghost I had just unleashed upon them. I reached the heavy oak door. My hand, wrinkled and spotted with age, closed around the cold brass handle. For a moment I paused, listening. Not to their screams, but to the silence that was waiting for me on the other side. 50 years. 50 years of tiptoeing around a sleeping monster. 50 years of biting my tongue until it bled. 50 years of being a beautiful, silent fixture in a gilded cage. I turned the handle. The latch clicked, a sound as final and definitive as a gunshot. I stepped out into the quiet, sterile hallway and pulled the door shut behind me. The sounds of their ruin were instantly muffled, reduced to a dull, impotent thrum. I didn't run. I walked, my posture straight, my steps even, down the long corridor and into the waiting elevator. As the doors slid shut, sealing me in polished steel and silence, I saw my reflection. I looked old. I looked tired. But for the first time, I looked like myself. The drive home was surreal. The familiar streets of Maple Creek, the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes seemed like a set from a play I was no longer in. Every corner held a memory, but the memories had lost their sting. They were just facts now, data points from a life that belonged to someone else. There was the corner market where Tiffany had once berated me for buying the wrong brand of coffee. There was the park where Leo had promised to bring Chloe to visit, a promise he never kept. They were just places now. The emotional charge had been disconnected. I pulled into the driveway of the house on Sycamore Street. It didn't feel like my prison anymore. It was just a house, large, empty, and haunted by a hollowness that had nothing to do with Richard's death and everything to do with how we had lived. I let myself in. The air was still, thick with the scent of lilies from the funeral. I walked through the downstairs rooms one last time. There was the armchair they had moved to the basement, my favorite one, where I used to sit and watch the birds. There was the kitchen counter where Tiffany had left passive-aggressive notes about my supposed messiness. I touched the cool granite. Nothing. I felt nothing. The power they held over me was built on a foundation of wealth and fear, and I had just signed that foundation over to them, complete with all its hidden cracks and explosive charges. Chloe was waiting in the foyer, just as we'd planned. She was sitting on the bottom step of the grand staircase, a small backpack at her feet. She looked up when I entered, her young face a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't say anything. She just stood up and ran to me, wrapping her arms around my waist. I held her tight, feeling the frailness of her 16-year-old frame. She was the only piece of this life that was real, the only part worth saving. "Is it done, Grandma?" she whispered into my dress. "It's done," I said, my voice steady. "Go get your bag. I have one for me." In my bedroom, a small duffel bag was already packed. It contained very little, a few changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book I loved before I met Richard, my toothbrush. There was nothing else I wanted from that house. I walked over to the dresser and opened a small lacquered box. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. It wasn't from me. It was from Richard. Arthur had given it to me during one of our secret meetings. On it were two things: the login details for a bank account and a short, simple message: for the fire escape. R. He knew. He had always known this day might come. He had built the cage, but he had also, in his own twisted, controlling way, built a fire escape. The account was clean, untraceable, filled with enough money for a new life, but not so much as to be considered a fortune. It wasn't part of the inheritance. It was something separate, a reward, perhaps, for playing my part for 50 years. Or maybe it was just his final, controlling move, dictating the terms of my freedom even in death. I didn't care about his motives. I only cared about the key he had left behind. As Chloe and I walked out the front door for the last time, I didn't look back. There were no ghosts here for me anymore. My revenge was never about taking their money or destroying their lives in a fit of rage. That would have been too simple, too crude. It was about giving them exactly what they wanted, exactly what they believed they were owed. I gave them the kingdom, and with it the crown of thorns, the poisoned chalice, and all the ravenous wolves that prowled its borders. I gave them the ugly, dangerous truth they had been living off of, but had been too privileged and too ignorant to see. The hum of the bus was a soothing, monotonous drone. Chloe was asleep, her head resting on my shoulder, her breathing deep and even. She looked peaceful, younger than her 16 years. Outside the large, tinted window, the manicured suburbs of Maple Creek had long since melted away, replaced by the sprawling, anonymous highways of the Midwest. The landscape was flat and vast, an endless expanse of brown earth and pale blue sky. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, a new message. It was from Leo. The screen glowed with his frantic, terrified words. "What did you do?" I stared at the message for a long time. I could feel the panic radiating from it, the desperate plea for an answer, an explanation, a way out. He was a child who had just realized the monster under his bed was real and that his own father had put it there. They were trapped in the house, in the empire, in the life of luxury they had craved so desperately. They were chained to the very thing they thought would set them free. The golden cage was now theirs, and the door had just been locked from the outside. My thumb hovered over the screen. I could have replied. I could have written 1,000 different things. But words were for the life I had left behind. Silence was my new language. With a simple, deliberate press, I deleted the message. Then I deleted the conversation. Then I powered the phone off and slipped it back into my bag. It was the last shackle, and it fell away with a whisper. I leaned my head back against the cool glass of the window and watched the world blur past. A weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying for 5 decades had finally lifted. It wasn't a sudden, explosive release, but a slow, quiet unfurling, like a fist that had been clenched for so long it had forgotten how to be a hand. The air I breathed in felt different, cleaner, fuller. For the first time in 50 years, I wasn't Richard's wife, or Leo's mother, or Tiffany's burden. I was just a woman on a bus, heading west with her granddaughter. I had no destination. I had no plan. All I had was the open road ahead of me, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I was finally and completely free.